Christopher, Apple just had their Worldwide Developer Conference, and as we talked about the last time, we were disappointed, but also, respectful of their decision to cancel Project Titan, the car. Like, we understood, too bad the Apple car didn't emerge, but totally makes sense not to compete in a market where, they weren't gonna, they were just gonna shrink the pie for the 24%. So we'll still wait and see what happened, but we were kind of hopeful that there would be some news on the AI front. So what'd you think?
I actually, contrary to a lot of people's opinion, think what Apple and Tim Cook just did was absolutely brilliant. First of all, let me say off the top, we in America, we in the Western world are incredibly lucky that Microsoft, $3 trillion company, Apple, $3 trillion company, OpenAI category king in generative AI, and I put Google in there and several others. We're lucky that these are American companies because Putin said it. The country that wins in AI will win the world. So that's the first point. The second point is I think Apple is more important than the governments of many countries because all of us live our lives on Apple. And so I think what we want from the leadership of these companies is thoughtful, aggressive innovation and new category design. And I think that's what we just got from Apple, and most people missed it. So they announced a new category. They called Apple AI brand / product a personal intelligence system. And what the aha is, a personal intelligence system is not an application. AI is not a new category. AI is the category. It's going to be everywhere. And that's essentially what they said. Now let's break down personal intelligence system. Many people forget that Apple was the primary category designer of a new category almost 4 decades ago called the personal computer. And so Apple really did several things here. Once, they announced what I believe is a aggressively thoughtful evolutionary approach to embedding AI. And 2, they announced a new category of AI focused where they live, which is on the consumer. And what do we know about Apple? Apple is legendary at delivering legendary consumer experiences. So they also published, I think it was 4, Eddie, kind of core tenets of essentially their POV of how AI should be used in an Apple context and around safety and around usability and value to the customer. I'm not using exactly all their words, but it was around these key themes. And so the reason the stock's up so much today is Apple chose not to compete with OpenAI, which is what I think a lot of people wanted them to do. It's proof that OpenAI has won. It's over. When both Microsoft and Apple do strategic partnerships with you and bet, in the case of Microsoft, a meaningful percentage of their AI strategy. In the case of Apple, we'll find out over time. It's clear they're going to do things internally with their own development. It's clear they may partner with others. However, the reality is they just did a massive partnership deal with Apple. So Sam Altman has category designed his way into the leadership position in generative AI. The other thing I think it shows us, Eddie, Tim Cook is fucking smart. Think about this. Tim could have said, no, we're going to compete with OpenAI. Second of all, he could have said, well, we can't do a partnership with OpenAI because they're partnered with Microsoft. Microsoft owns almost half the company. And if we do this, it's going to advantage Microsoft. And even though we don't compete as much as we used to, they're still a competitor in many ways. So we can't enrich Microsoft. He didn't do that either. What did they do? He put the customer first. Legendary category designers focus on customers, their problems, their needs, their opportunities. And so I think what we saw this week or recently here was genius from Apple, a thoughtfully aggressive, evolutionary, not revolutionary approach. And that may sound funny coming from me praising that. But I don't think we want the CEO of a $3 trillion company who's more important than some governments to be going crazy, to be throwing crazy passes. I think we want them to be thoughtfully aggressive. I also think that they were able to put aside stupidities around competition derangement syndrome, to focus on what matters, which is how do we deliver legendary AI embedded across all of our technology in a way that serves our customers. And I think that's what Apple just did. And they did it in the context of announcing a new category, personal intelligence system. And I think that's why their stock popped so much. And I think that's why it was genius.
I think your framing of Apple as a almost a part of the G7, so to speak, right, is exactly right. Apple, it's more than a stock and more than a company. It's owned by so many index funds. It's owned by so many pension funds. Like Tim Cook probably uniquely understands the role of steward he plays. Of he can't take big risks, which I understand that at least stupid ones with it, and and certainly as you were kind of laying out, like I'm of two minds. One is that the move is genius in the sense that it almost guarantees that the upgrade cycle is going to go back to where it was beforehand, because all of these generative AI, features, like I'm just kind of looking at the Genmojis where you can create a custom category. You could make a bean the dog emoji if you wanted to, Siri enhancements. That's probably the one that I'm the most excited about, is like particularly in the backdrop of how excited I was about Siri in 2011 when it launched and how disappointing it's been. Like if just Siri caught up to chat GPT level functionality, that'd be amazing, especially if trained on my own texts and emails, which is both
And
scary and
especially
exciting.
if Siri could learn to spell my wife's name and understand
Yeah.
that I almost never use the word ducking.
Well, the part of so there's and I think what you just described lays out kind of my bipolarness around how I feel about Apple's move. Because, like, on the one hand, the spelling Carrie's name correctly makes a lot of sense, and it's kind of haha silly. It's annoying. Kristen gets really mad when you spell her name with an I versus an E. Like, she gets really mad with that. So I appreciate the value of that. Now, on the other hand, the thing that scares me, Christopher, is like whenever you see these lawsuits, kind of whether they're in a business context or whatever, what's the deposition doing? They're going through your text and they're saying, did you say this? Did you say that? And blah, blah, blah. Right. And so, like, on the one hand, having Apple and whether it is personal intelligence system, whether it is on the privacy cloud that they were describing, or whether on the, hey, you can, if you want, you can opt in to go outside the walled garden to chat GPT. Right. So it is your choice. So on the one hand, I respect they're putting the consumer front. I'm the super consumer guy. Of course, I would say that. And on the other hand, Christopher, I'm really, I don't know if I'm being paranoid about this, but, even super consumers get it wrong in the sense that there are certain things that I want that aren't good for me. Like, the Ghost of Christmas Future Eddie would say, don't do that today. Right. And that's the part that I'm a little nervous about, is that Apple is famous for vertically integrating almost everything. And so this whole thing of leveraging ChatGPT probably wasn't a choice for them. And we know they're going to do it Gemini, and for all I know, it's a smokescreen for them to catch up, and then they're going to kick them all to the side, which I would actually feel better about, if they were to do that. And because I do like the walled garden in the same way that they won't let you sideload apps into the app store. Like, they're very, very protective and a little big brothery, but at least they're one of the few advocates on privacy. And the second part that makes me nervous, Christopher, is, we talked about this a while back, is Warren Buffett's a big shareholder over at Apple. And I'm a little nervous that I wonder to what extent has Apple's shareholder base moved to the two types of investors that you talked about, those that bet on performance and those that bet on potential. And I can't decide who's happy about this one. Like, on the one hand, anything AI makes all the potential people happy, and on the other hand, all of this stuff, is probably to Warren Buffett, wonka, 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 but you got to buy iPhone 15, you got to buy iPhone 16 or whatever, right? Because the data requirements and the compute requirements on the phone are just going to go up with this. So I think I'm a little bit of two minds here. Of one is like, I really hope this is just the opening act and not the final. There's something very special about Tim Cook, and like when I contrast him to Steve Jobs, is that I think Jobs was a genius in many respects on the product side of the Magic Triangle, and Tim Cook is a genius on the company side of the Magic Triangle. Like the two of them together, like an amazing 1-2 punch. And I just asked, ironically, ChatGPT, who is likely to succeed Tim Cook? Because that, to me, he's been there since 2011, Christopher. So it's 13 years. I don't know how. I don't think he's a super old guy or the like. So maybe he'll stay there longer. You don't know what to believe about ChatGPT, but they're saying Jeff Williams is one of the candidates, chief operating officer, and he's the master of all supply chain. So Luca Maestri, I think the CFO, Eddie Q, former head of marketing and now the head of internet services and software. On Tiernis, there's the head of engineering, hardware engineering, and then Deirdre O'Brien, the head of retail and people. Like, I think it'll be really telling who is the runner-up. They're saying it's Jeff right now, and that tells me
and I
supply
just
chain and the company is what matters. So
I just checked. Tim's only 63. And if memory is correct, the average age of an S&P 500 CEO, I think, is 58, somewhere around there. So, look, it's very conceivable if his health is well and he's still committed and so forth and so on, that he could do this for easily another 10 years. So it may not be a problem for a while. I think with AI in particular, this is what I want Apple to be doing. I want them to be super thoughtful. Now, to your point, there was a point in time where Apple bought chips from lots of other people, including Intel. They might still, but of course, they now manufacture their own chips, to your point on vertical integration. So is it very possible that everything you said is a likely outcome, and that what they will do is, if they're wise, what they will do is they'll do the exact same thing with Gemini, and they'll figure out a way to produce an amalgamated result from the two. That would be incredibly interesting if they're contractually able to do that. And who knows, they may end up, as a result of doing these things, they may end up building their own over time, just like they have, for example, in the chip space. However, on the flip side, I believe, I might be wrong, we should check it, but I believe they still buy glass from Corning. So there's some areas where they decide we don't need to vertically integrate, and others where we do. It'll be interesting to see what they do here. But I love the fact that what they're focused on is this aha, that AI is not an application, it's the application. It's not a new category. It's all new categories. There's two kinds of startups today, AI startups and startups that are not going to be around very long, right? Every company is an AI company today. And so I think what they're doing is very smart. Now, the other thing I think is important to touch on, Eddie, is absolute power corrupts absolutely. We know this. And as good a guy as we think Tim is, and as good of a core values as it appears that Apple has historically had, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we need radical transparency, particularly in AI, and we need very good oversight. We need very good regulations. My fear, however, is anybody who spends any time consuming content out of Washington, D.C., knows that our ability to have a thoughtful conversation in the Congress or in the halls of lawmakers in Washington, D.C. is de minimis at best. I mean, we can't even solve very basic, stupid problems that we all know are problems. And so that's fear number one. Fear number two is there are a lot of legislators in our country who have their quote unquote secretaries print out their quote unquote emails so they can dictate a quote unquote memo. There's that famous interview where Senator Hatch asks Mark Zuckerberg how they make money if their products are free. And he said, well, sir, we sell ads. And that was the whole point of the fucking congressional testimony in the first place, was to figure out how they're monetizing us through ads. And Orrin Hatch didn't know that. And so I find that terrifying. All that said, I think if we were going to have people who are going to lead the world in AI, I'm glad they're Americans. And so far, and look, there are things we can criticize them on. And there's mistakes that Apple has made. And to this day, look, I like to use Google Maps. Well, if you email me an address, or if you text me an address and I click on it, it doesn't bring me to Google Maps. It asks me if I want to download Apple apps. I don't want Apple apps. I want Google apps. So Apple does some nefarious things to advantage their platform and disadvantage third parties. And there has been, and I think there might even be a lawsuit right now in Europe about that. So I think we need strong controls. But in general, personal intelligence, smart category design, and a evolutionary approach to embedding AI in all the products and technologies seems very smart. And it's exactly what Microsoft is doing. Right. Only Microsoft, of course, is much more of an enterprise company.
Right. The part that I think that when I think about Tim Cook and why I do like the personal intelligence services is think of a couple of S's: supply chain, excellence and optimization. I think of services, Apple TV, Apple News, Apple, card, and financial services is just they're just getting started there, I think. Security and privacy for sure. And simplification. Like I think he's kept that ethos from Jobs. Like those are the 4 S's that I think about, and that interestingly, personal intelligence services like touches on each of them, because supply chain excellence will keep going up because it just means they got to crank out more iPhones. Services, there's no shortage of like, hey, Siri, will you? I'm going to call it now. We're going to stop it. Will you go look up? I texted this to Christopher 7 years ago. Can you go find it? Like even that would be extraordinarily valuable, right? To hey, is my relationship with this person healthy or toxic? Look at my text and tell me, like the personal intelligence services as a counselor, as a, what, because there's a buddy of mine, Garrett Sheridan, he runs a consulting firm, Lotus Blue. He does a lot of professional services consulting, and they built an AI model for a law firm that allowed them to predict when a client was going to go bye-bye based on the frequency and the nature of the emails. It was really brilliant. Like, hey, big time client increases the frequency of email, and the shorter the emails and the less they're talking about issues and ideas, it's probably a waning relationship and you ought to invest in it. And it was a massive outcome for them. And so like, I think about that on the personal side, like, so there's no shortage of stuff where I do have faith that I think from a use case perspective, I think that Apple's really good at that. I wish they would kind of do in the same vein of like when Cook was really kind of hardcore on the fitness with the Apple watches and like trying to, measure your blood glucose. Like I wish they would pick and lean into a couple of problems like healthcare, be it physical or mental health. I'm glad that he's a responsible steward. I think Apple will continue to do well, and good for all of us that are shareholders of Apple.
And good for all of us who are users of Apple.
Oh yeah, users.
If Apple was a horrible company, or they made a series of horrible mistakes, or they were run by people who had seriously questionable ethics or were doing illegal criminal things, we would be in a shit ton of trouble. And so, again, I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm not saying they haven't screwed up. I'm not saying that some of their business practices aren't worthy of at least pushing back on, if not criticism. I think 30% in the App Store and charging for in-app purchase. There's a lot we could talk about. That said, his stewardship is legendary. Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more about that.
Well, and I think it is that I wonder if that's perhaps his legacy. Whenever he does decide to step down, his stewardship, it's no mean feat, no small feat to carry on the torch of Jobs and to build on top of it in the way that he has. And I think
arguably the hardest follow-up in history. Totally. And if you were to, just by way of comparison, there was a point in time that you and I remember where Jack Welch was the most celebrated CEO in the world. And Jack said many times, the only way you can evaluate my tenure is to look at what happens with my successor, Jeff Immelt. As we know, Jeff went on to destroy GE as we know it, and showed himself to be a horrible leader. And so if you take Jack at his word, then the harbinger of whether Cook did a great job is whoever's next, what
Right.
job they do.
Right.
But for the 13 years he's been in charge, imagine having to take over from a person who is arguably stands next to some of the greatest
Wow.
innovators and entrepreneurs and creators of anything of all time.
So I think you know, his the degree of difficulty, no question. And I think where I'm kind of left now is not that dissimilar from what we are going through at Category Pirates. I think you described it as, you know, a dink and dunk pass versus a, you know, a 40-yard pass. Like, I suspect that they have 40-yard passes that they're preparing that they haven't talked about yet, that I do hope that they will continue to launch. You know, I would love to hear how personalized intelligence system helps Vision Pro become mainstream and become, you know, make that become its new category. Like that to me, if I were Cook, like that would be like, how do I get that platform up and running? Because that one truly has a lot of potential. As I look at my computer screen in my office, like I would just love to get rid of all this hard stuff and just put a headset on and see, you know, all these, you know, different screens up there. But I think the Genmoji and the little things of, you know, kind of like, you know, they're fun, they're kind of, you know, very much incremental things. Like I think of us at Category Pirates of like, we're still working on our LLM and we're excited about what that has the potential to do, but that's the 40-yard pass. And at some level we have our own dink and dunk of like, let's convert all of our mini books that haven't been narrated using, you know, AI voices of AI Pirate Christopher and AI Pirate Eddie. And, you know, those are good. And so I would say if I look at our own activity, it's perhaps a reflection of what we see in the marketplace of, you know, and I
Well,
think as Cook
if
is
you look
doing
at
as
what we
well.
did, to put it in very simple terms, right? We decided we wanted to create our own LLM. We decided we wanted our own chatbot so that people could interact with that LLM and have the world's number one, largest and fastest growing content database for category creation and category design. And we were building that. And we were on the 5-yard line. We were about ready to launch when we realized this custom thing that we built. There were a bunch of companies who'd built, if you will, off-the-shelf software that can do the things that we paid a genius kid to do, cobbled together. And we've decided to stop using the thing, or to stop pursuing the custom thing, and to move to a package thing, because it looks like some of these package vendors might really have something. And there's several of these vendors that we need to talk to now. That's exactly what happened at Apple, best we could tell, right? They're building their own generative AI, as many were. And then OpenAI emerges as the clear category winner. And then this move makes sense. And so the other part of this, I think, that's interesting to underscore is different versus better, right? Apple just shot a $10 billion Apple Car project, if we understand the rumors correctly, right? Because they decided that they couldn't do different, and they didn't want to compete. Fascinating. This sounds like the same kind of decision-making framework that they used here on how to come up with their strategy. And I just double-checked. You want some fun data, Eddie? So Tim Cook, this is according to Google Gemini, Tim Cook became CEO of Apple in August 2011. At the time, Apple's market cap was around $350 billion. As of today, June 16th, 2024, the market cap is around, you ready? $2.83 trillion. That means that under Tim Cook's leadership, their market cap has increased by approximately $2.4 trillion. And I asked Gemini, what is that as a percentage? And that, Eduardo, is a 708.57% increase in market cap since he took over as CEO.
I mean, amazing. So yeah, I have all the world of respect, as we both do. We're excited about what the future holds, and you know, I think we're both. You know, at some level, it's fun to do our own journey and watch everybody else's journey, and I think we'll learn from what's going on. But I think category design remains a very useful lens to evaluate all of these market moves. So,
Well, and the biggest aha, I think, for everybody here is new categories create new categories. And monster new, mega, enormo, ginormo, King Kong, Godzilla sized mega trend categories like AI end up creating thousands and thousands of new categories of innovation and capability. And they're leading the charge in a very thoughtful way.